when you hear a song like Fade to Black by Metallica, which is clearly about suicide, you know, you don't wallow in misery like you might with listen to The Cure or Bauhaus. It's more like
I like The Cure, for God's sake.
I love The Cure. Sometimes I like wallowing in misery too.
Jon Wiederhorn is a veteran rock journalist who wrote Louder Than Hell, the definitive oral history of metal. He is also the co-author of Ministry, The Lost Gospels, according to Jourgensen. In the past, Jon has worked on editorial staffs at Rolling Stone, Guitar Magazine, and MTV. He is a senior writer for Revolver magazine and regularly writes for major publications including Guitar World, emusic.com, and Spin. In this episode, we talk with Jon about why the topic of death is so omnipresent in the metal music genre and why it makes this music so fascinating. This podcast is full of anecdotes, references, and metal bands. So be warned, if you don't listen to heavy metal, be prepared to get the urge to play some heavy guitar riffs afterwards. But that's not all. Physicist Philip Moriarty has also joined us for this episode. Philippe is a huge metal fan and he has even written the book When the Uncertainty Principle Goes to 11 or How to Explain Quantum Physics with Heavy Metal. Please support the show by liking and sharing this episode on social media, and to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, sign up for our newsletter at deafandgal.com. It will also be a massive help to us if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, which you can do right now by simply clicking the subscribe button. Now, get ready for this death metal episode, Louder Than Death.
Death is a very, very prevalent subject in metal and always has been. Beyond that, unfortunately, a lot of heavy metal musicians kind of burn the candle at both ends and live extreme lives and have passed away prematurely, which is sad but true, to quote a Metallica song.
Song about that. I was about to say. You know it's
I think from the days of Black Sabbath, who are credited as being really the first valid metal band, although there were, you know, precursors in the proto-metal stuff from MC5, Blue Cheer, and the Stooges, amongst, you know, some others. But Sabbath really came out with the darkness and the doom. And from there, every band really took their lead and expanded upon it. And from the start, metal has always been about extremism. And what's the ultimate extremism? It's death. Pushing taboos and addressing things that aren't acceptable in mainstream culture is a very big part of the metal aesthetic. Also, metal fans tend to be on the younger age of the spectrum. So while there's the fascination with death, there's not the cold, hard reality of it. And there's this feeling of immortality. It's not something that upsets them to hear about. It's more empowering. When you hear a song like Fade to Black by Metallica, which is clearly about suicide, you know, you don't wallow in misery like you might with listen to The Cure or Bauhaus. It's more like
I like The Cure, for God's sake.
I love The Cure. Sometimes I like wallowing in misery too.
Nothing wrong with a good bit of wallowing in misery.
The metal gives you that sense of and you know, empowerment.
So I did some research, actually, to be honest, because that was this intuition that when you look at what metal, what are the typical lyrics, it's all about death somehow. But that's what was my intuition. So, but I tried to look on Google, and there's this article. But basically, a guy went to metalarchives.com I don't know if you know this website, but it's a global.
Sure, very well.
Well, so it's a global database where you have everything about metal, and you have a search engine. So the guy basically went there and he looked at all the lyrical themes. What are the topics of the songs? And he did a classification. And apparently 40% of all songs in metal are about death. The second theme is about war. The third theme is about life. And then there's hate, love, and I think there's 0.02% about optimism. Something like that.
Well, actually, you raise an interesting point, because a lot of musicians raise these really harsh and negative themes, and it actually has a positive effect on the listener. If you're singing about the agony of your life and your parents' divorce in an obscure way and addressing hatred and violence, and, you know, some other kid who has had a harsh upbringing, maybe an abusive upbringing, or even just a bad relationship with a girlfriend, or is being picked on at school, you know, they can relate to those feelings of frustration and anger. So it's very cathartic, and it's very much a fictitious approach. You know, a lot of these lyrics aren't telling you to go out and shoot up a school or, you know, commit horrific acts of violence. A lot of it is kind of, even if it's rooted in the occult, it's kind of like a fantasy. You know, even the bands that throw blood on the audience or bring animal skulls on stage, it's all theatricality. There are some pure Satanists out there. Most of the occult music is really rooted in performance and drama. You know.
But it's interesting, Jon, you mentioned the sort of demographic and it being sort of the younger side. I'd agree maybe 30 or 40 years ago, but the weekend was actually at Jones Beach Theatre in New York. Demographic was pretty pushed towards, you know, I felt that I was among the youngest there.
So did I. Well,
which was wonderful. But I think those of us who got into it in the 70s and 80s or growing up, we're keeping it. I think a lot of the thing about metal that I love is that sense of community. And, you know, it's a communal experience. It's almost like a bloody, you know, going to church for some. Look at Slayer, for example. You know, it's like the anti-church or whatever. You've got this incredible crowd dynamic. Yeah, I think we're growing up a little bit with the music. The other thing as well is, do you remember Deicide? Do you remember a band called Deicide? Yeah, so they were an interesting one who claimed to sort of have the whole satanic element, but when push came to shove, the singer said he was going to commit suicide at 33. Didn't happen. So I think you're right about the entertainment aspects.
Yeah. Addressing the age demographic, one cool thing about metal, more than any other genre I've found, is that metal fans who really embrace the genre at a young age and really appreciate it for the musical value, not as a trend, tend to stick with it through their lives. So you will find people in their 50s and even 60s at concerts by Kiss and Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, because they grew up with that. But at the same time, you know, metal is constantly evolving. And if you go to shows by Killswitch Engage or Atreyu or anybody from the newer school, it tends to, the demographic skews much younger. I think it appeals to people in their youth to begin with, and some of them drop off when they, you know, kind of lose that rage or anger or get a job and you know, kind of a wife and discover that there's life outside of aggression and hostility.
No, I don't think getting a wife and children necessarily takes you away from aggression and hostility.
No, I can vouch for that. Especially when you have to pay for them to go to college. So.
Seriously, though, but on that point, it's not just, it's interesting because I think for the outsider, and you're certainly not an outsider, Jon, you have an incredibly encyclopedic knowledge of metal. For the outsider, it does seem to be all about aggression, but actually there's an incredible beauty to a lot of it. There's a band like Opeth, for example, the most sublime harmonies and melodies, and then on a knife edge they go into the most extreme sort of death metal. Similarly, even with Slipknot, you know, a song like Snuff, that's a beautiful song, and a song that's incredibly well orchestrated, you know, as good as anything out there sort of in any other genre, and better in terms of the lyrics. Some of the lyrics are Shakespearean. It's incredible.
Go back to early Judas Priest, the not Sin After Sin. Sad Wings of Destiny had not Diamonds and Rust. Now I'm blanking on the big song, which is
Gates of Death.
no, the epic, the ballad, but beautiful arrangements, and a lot of these musicians have a lot of skill and are able to ebb and flow with the dynamics of their of the construction of their music.
Absolutely.
Otherwise it gets boring. You know, there are
Absolutely.
black metal and death metal bands that just pound your skull in, and that's fun, but it gets redundant.
Yeah.
You know, a good song is rooted in melody
And dynamics, absolutely.
yeah, and you can put as much, you know, shredding guitars and grinding noise and growling vocals on top of it, but there's got to be. I mean, Slayer had amazing guitar licks. You know, they had really strong. They were eerie and they were, you know, kind of horrific, but you can hum a Slayer song. It's kind of hard to hum a Mayhem song or
exactly. Yeah.
Gorgoroth tune.
Yeah, that's a very good. That's a key point about Slayer, because the riffs are so memorable. Yeah.
The thing about metal is it has to build upon itself in order to remain an extreme art form. When I was a teenager, I thought thrash metal was just insanely heavy, and Venom was the most extreme thing you could possibly ever hear. Then Metallica and, you know, Possessed and Slayer. What could be heavier than Slayer? I mean, still, even though they're not the fastest band in metal, they still remain one of the heaviest. Their tempos and their lyrics are quite tame compared to groups like Carcass, Cannibal Corpse. Yeah, absolutely. Aborted. You know, there's these bands that just sing about sheer gore, not even horror movies, just, you know, bodily dismemberment. You know, that's fine if it's an outlet, it's a release.
But it's interesting you mentioned Carcass, because I loved Carcass. And then with the Soilwork album, wasn't it? Where they just changed completely, got a lot more melodic, and the guitar lines became a lot more melodic. And as you say, it really is all about the song, and adding in that extra dynamic that they didn't have when they were going full out gore, full out really in your face, double bass drums, etc. When Carcass sort of expanded things out a little bit, you could feel the musicianship. They were always very good musicians, but once they added in that melody, the musicianship comes to the fore.
Yeah, you're referencing Heartwork was the album.
That's it.
Yeah. That's when they kind of turned the page and inserted enough melody to be more accessible, but not to be kind of sellout. I mean, they were still very on the fringe.
It was interesting that John said about the being young and again all those the topics of death, and it is empowering because they're young and they've got this sense of immortality and it's so far off. But where I'm going, and Philip raised it there, is metal fans a lot of them stay metal fans. So what impact does that have now when people are getting closer to death and they're listening to the same lyrics? Is that having the same empowering feeling, or are they remembering how they first experienced it, or does that change?
I think once they reach a certain age and they've experienced death in the family and friends, and unfortunately a lot of metal fans live somewhat extreme lives, so there are overdoses, and there are, you know, not amongst all listeners, because there's certainly some professional white collar intellectual professionals that are huge fans of Pantera or Slayer and have never taken drugs in their life. There are people who live on the fringes of society, and metal is all about being on the fringe and expressing yourself, going all out. So, but when these guys tend to get a little older and they've had those direct relationships with death, I think the music is nostalgic, and it almost is an escape.
Yeah.
The lyrics don't matter so much. It's more about the feeling that they had when they listened to it, when they discovered it. And even when you're old, you can kind of laugh in the face of death, and you hear it from guys in their 70s, you know, Bruce Dickinson from Iron Maiden and Rob Halford from Judas Priest. They're getting up there, the guys in Sabbath, and they're still singing about, you know, doom and gloom and what lurks on the other side, if anything. And mortality has been a big issue in metal. The idea of is there a forever after, and is there nothingness?
According to quantum physics, anyway, there isn't anything after it, but that's a whole other subject.
No, damn it. You've ruined my day. I thought it was good. Floating with the angels and playing a harp.
Actually, that's a good thing. What I like about metal and metal music is they put out there these kind of ideas, this kind of, things that society, they don't want to look at, things which are more dark. Like what we do right now in this podcast, we talk about death, but look at us. We joke. We are not morbid. We're not like, sorry, Keith, but you have exception. We are not goths and blacks and that's, we have humor in as well. But here, this subject, this topic, which these bands are putting out there, I think it helps. And this is what you said at the beginning. It helps us, somehow we can relate.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think the same applies for horror films. Stephen King once said he writes horror stories to get more in touch with death and with the dark side of the human existence, because there's certainly they need a yin and yang there. They're delightful moments, but life can be horrific. I think most of Western society, and there's no questioning it, we shun death. We don't accept it. We push it off, and then when you're at the last moment, it's something that's terribly sad and terribly, terribly upsetting. And I'm not saying that those who accept death more readily aren't going to be scared or face it with any more bravery, but there are other cultures that do have much more of a focus on death, because it's part of a life cycle. Born, you live, you die. And to deny that is to deny a crucial part of the human experience.
What would be your favorite, if you have a favorite death song?
A favorite death song?
Yeah, in metal. Would you have that?
Boy, there are so many.
That's it.
Slayer's Angel of Death is such a classic. It's a controversial song. It's one that pushes the envelope. It's one that's upset an awful lot of people because it's about the horrific exploits of Joseph Mengele in the Holocaust, the Nazi surgeon. But the band don't glorify the subject matter. They discuss it in a very blunt and descriptive way, but it got them in a lot of trouble. There are a lot of Jewish people running record labels, and as a Jewish person myself, I have to admit, when I first heard it, I kind of paused. I'm like, well, I love this band, but you don't write songs about the Holocaust. But because there are certain taboos, and part of metal is pushing those taboos. Mm-hmm. So I've got to say, it's an amazing song. And had it been one of these National Socialist black metal kind of things, I would absolutely shun it, because that's the one side of metal that I just can't abide with. And I think everybody has their point. And it's funny, because I have no problem with anti-religious metal, anti-Christian metal that attacks society and religion and structural norms. But these hateful bands that just come out to preach these messages of aggression and superiority, a lot of white supremacist bands, and that's something that just I won't listen to and I won't endorse.
The issue is when it starts to bleed into the mainstream, like Phil Anselmo's outburst was just a bit worrying in terms of the white power thing. Yeah, I
know. I love Phil. Phil, and
I love Pantera, but
Phil puts his foot in his mouth, and he's done it repeatedly over time. I'd love to say that Phil is not a racist, and he's not homophobic, and he's not anti-Semitic, and I've had numerous conversations with him. He's always given me great interviews. He's a thoughtful guy. He does stupid things. He puts his foot in his mouth. Everybody has a bad joke in them about another type of people or their own people. If you're Woody Allen or Mel Brooks, you can get away with
exactly, or an Irish joke as well. Yeah,
right.
Coming from somebody who's Irish rather than.
But also the timing there at an event to commemorate the life of his bandmate Dimebag Darrell, who was killed on stage. Yeah, the timing to raise his arm and say "White Power" was regretful.
It's interesting. We've been talking about it certainly was regret. We're talking about sort of the death aspects, but one thing about metal, I think, particularly a metal gig, is just how life affirming it can be. And Sabbath had a song called Never Say Die, and there's an awful lot of that energy, and it makes you feel good to be alive, which is, somebody who isn't a metal fan, sometimes it's difficult to get that across. We were just talking about Keith and I, just John, before you came on, about Live After Death and the energy of that bloody album. And I remember putting that on as a teenager, still put it on now, and you're right, you just recapture that energy. It's incredible, and it makes you feel good to be alive, despite when they're talking about the Number of the Beast or
what's the Live Maiden album.
The Live Maiden album.
I mean, look at the Trooper. You take my life, but I'll take yours too. But it's done with a sense of triumph, and
exactly.
But that's what makes it the catharsis and the, I don't want to use the word cartoon, but it's a fictional kind of approach and appreciation.
It feels like theater, and it's like what you were talking about. Is I think once something is, I think pushing the envelope, the boundaries, talking about the taboo subjects to bring the discussion out into the open. I think there's a healthy thing. But once it's about inciting sort of hatred or looking to inspire any kind of action along that line, I think that is a line too far.
At the same time, though, there were a lot of Norwegian black metal bands that got engaged in church burnings as a part of their way to protest the Christian establishment and the way it took over pagan traditions in Norway and the Viking kind of philosophies. And unfortunately, some of these guys also ended up killing each other. I laugh about it because it's just so absurd, but some of them were really, really strong musicians. I think Mayhem's first album, it wasn't really their first. Death Crush was their first, but De Mysteriis Dom Satanis, I think, was the first really strong album, and the last to feature Euronymous, who was later killed by a bandmate. Actually, he was in another band, but he played on that album because they needed a bassist, because you can't make this stuff up. Their former bassist quit after their former vocalist shot himself in the head, and the guitarist took a photo of his corpse to use for promotional purposes.
Wow.
It's absurd. And if you're a metal fan who likes the extreme side of metal, there's nothing more extreme. It's like, holy crap, like this is crazy. But the music is good. Some of those guys were talented.
That sounds like some sort of twisted advert. It's like, you guys don't know, but the music is good. Like, you can get it now from your local store. But
if you see that, if you read
there's none of them left.
Most of what people focus on in that press is about the murders and the outrageous crimes, because that kind of stuff sells. That kind of stuff, the lurid is fascinating, and that's maybe why death is such a big subject in metal, to kind of come full circle, because these ideas and these themes aren't things you see on regular evening television. Breaking shows like Breaking Bad and The Evil Dead do broach those subjects, but they say The Evil Dead, The Walking Dead. But you have in metal a form of music that addresses death to celebrate life.
What's about actually the genre? I've seen this documentary, I don't remember exactly the title, but it says that with Nirvana, basically, and Kurt Cobain, it killed the genre. The metal genre was killed with this thing. So is it the death of metal? Is metal? And I can see Philippe say, no, it's still alive and kicking, and I'm a fan till the end.
Hair metal, maybe. Hair metal was killed by Cobain.
Yeah. So what's about that?
It is alive. In the 90s, metal went through a kind of confused period. You had a lot of these commercial metal bands who were making their songs poppier and poppier and cross-dressing and trying to appeal to this kind of outrageous Sunset Strip audience. And they sold millions of records. And then came Metallica, Slayer, and Guns N' Roses. and then beyond bands who focused more on being a part of a universal experience rather than putting on a show and being on stage and above the crowd that's below you. Hair metal kind of died a premature death. Maybe it wasn't premature because a lot of those bands had worn out a lot of good ideas and were becoming very watered down in an effort to be commercial. Even thrash bands took a beating from the grunge scene. In part, it's because thrash had been going since about 1983, and after 7 years, it got kind of stale. You know, even Slayer were having trouble topping their best riffs. So it needed to kind of gestate for a while. And that's when the underground music kind of reared its head, and you did have a lot more death metal specifically, which evolved into black metal, and a lot more of these counterculture bands that weren't about even appealing to the mainstream. And what's ironic about that is some of them, you know, Morbid Angel wound up on a major label. So did Carcass, and they were on Earache, which then got a deal with Columbia. So, you know, anything that'll sell, the big companies will take hold of, despite what the lyrical content or the musical noise level might involve.
So, knowing that from the statistics, 40% of his song, or more or less, I don't know, is about death. How does it play for you? Is there any influence for you on this, hearing all these songs? Did you grow, you know, I don't know, have you become more death aware, less death aware? What about that?
That's an interesting question. I think once you sort of are exposed to it at an early age, it's like an epiphany for you. It's like, wow, listen to how intense these lyrics are, and they're poetic, and they're actually saying something. It's not just kill, 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 kill. Metallica wrote some songs about capital punishment, environmental destruction, governmental corruption. And there's a lot of die, 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 die in there too. There was subject matter woven within these aggressive themes that was insightful and thought-provoking. I think as one ages, if they're still into metal, the shock value kind of disappears until you see a group like Watain come on stage with basically an altar of decaying animal flesh, making the whole room smell like a slaughterhouse. And then they take a bucket of pig's blood and splash it over the first few rows. I knew they were going to do that, so I stood in the back of the venue, but it was hard to sit through it. The stench was so overpowering. And I actually interviewed the singer of the band, the frontman, who's an intelligent fellow. And, you know, I said, well, what do you think about the fans who love the music, but don't want to get splashed by blood and can't stand, you know, the stench makes them want to vomit? He says, I want them to leave. I don't want them, you know, this is no place for them if that's their reaction to the experience. I'm like, okay. He didn't say, don't listen to my music, don't buy my records. And something can always shock. But when I listen to metal, I listen for the musicality of it really these days. Lyrically, it's not as important. But I think even to the main metal fan, the music is what it's all about. The crushing chords, the aggressive energy, the speeds. And it makes these, you know, people want to dance or spin around and fling their fists and be in a mosh pit, dive off a stage. It's a great energy release, and it always has. So that's another real asset of metal. If you're pissed off, if you're angry, if you sort of don't assimilate with the mainstream, you go to these shows and you lose your mind. And for an hour and a half, not only are you with a group of your peers, but you're venting this aggression, and maybe things are a little bit easier when you leave.
Yeah, no, on that point, it's an interesting, from a perspective, sort of from the academic perspective, that we've got, certainly in the US, but in the UK especially so, there's a pretty strong crisis sort of mental health issues around students. You know, suicide rates are going up, more and more counselling is required. And for so many students, metal, I think, is a really, really important release. What I really dislike, and it's actually one of the reasons behind writing that book that we mentioned right at the start, is this idea that the music is metal for Neanderthals. It's often painted like that it's this really unintelligent and unintelligible noise, when it's so much more than that. And particularly there've been a number of studies that have shown that sort of both jazz and metal in terms of correlate quite well. Listening tastes, which are jazz and metal and classical, of course, correlate quite well with high levels of intelligence. Particularly on physicists, I love coming up soon, a couple of weeks' time will be the first day of the new term. I just love watching students come in, 20, 30 years younger, actually now 30 years younger than me, in the Metallica shirts, the Zeppelin shirts, the Sabbath shirts. It's just fucking wonderful. And, that it's got a real timeliness now. But for me, certainly, being able to lose myself in metal, being able to lose myself in sort of rock music was a really important release. Mm-hmm. And I'm certain that's the case. We should really involve, I think we should have metal therapy sessions at university. I think a lot of people will feel a lot better.
Yeah, I think metal since it began has always been stigmatized and demonized and marginalized because people who don't understand it or don't ascribe to extreme points of view just write it off as noise. Mm-hmm. Oh, these guys don't have any talent. They're just playing the same things over and over. They're just playing with amps turned up so loud and screaming. All they do is scream, Yeah, screaming has become part of the metal aesthetic. What they're screaming is, not only delivered in a cathartic way that stems from like hardcore and punk. If you decipher the lyrics, there is some valid content in there. So I think metal has a lot of appeal to a lot of people. Unfortunately, there is that knuckle dragging kind of condemnation of it. But there are different kind of segments of the population. There are these members of the academia and intelligentsia who love metal, and that's great. But then there are also trailer kids and kids who've grown up in underprivileged upbringings and maybe dropped out of high school, and they love Lamb of God and Slayer and Slipknot.
And it's a wonderful way of connecting those communities that you wouldn't find otherwise.
Yes.
Jon, you have some books actually, and maybe you can tell us everything about your books. It's the time, maybe.
The first book I wrote was, it remains kind of the most referred to and popular. It's an oral history of metal dating from the early 60s, well, late 60s really, with the proto-metal bands like MC5 and Alice Cooper and Blue Cheer. And then it goes all the way through doom metal, new wave of British heavy metal, thrash, hair metal, black metal, death metal, industrial metal, all the way up to the modern day, where I kind of stopped off with Slipknot and Lamb of God and Killswitch Engage and the new wave of American heavy metal, they call it, because those are the bands that I see that are really the last ones to have a major impact. And those guys are 15 years or so old right now. There have been newer bands and new evolutions since then. The book's 5 years old now. It's told strictly through the voices of musicians and people on the inside of the industry. And in addition to telling the history, there are a lot of outrageous stories, which everyone wants to read. I mean, it's all about the crazy antics, the groupies, the drugs, the blowing up of cars and throwing televisions out the window. A lot of these musicians have had really outrageous lifestyles, and it's part of the metal aesthetic. It's part of the don't give a damn sense of freedom of doing whatever you want, almost like a do what thou wilt, Aleister Crowley, kind of approach. After I did that, I went into biographies or memoirs, and it was actually maintenance was with Al Jourgensen of the band Ministry, and that was called Ministry of the Lost Gospels, according to Al Jourgensen. Came out on Da Capo. And spending a week with him and then another week later at his compound in Texas was just an outrageous tourism experience. I mean, he opened up in the interviews, and we had great interviews between excessive drunken spells and passing out. And I mean, he really, I think he's cooled down a little bit now. I know he smokes more pot than is produced in the state of California, but he's in LA now, and I'm not sure if he's drinking, but when he does, he tends to go over the top because he's an alcoholic, and he's the first to admit it. But he's lived a fascinating life, 33 years of heroin addiction, kind of a pioneer of the industrial music scene. So the other book that I did from a jumping point of Louder Than Hell was Scott Ian from Anthrax's memoir. He did the intro for Louder Than Hell. When I sent it back to him to proofread, he's like, man, this just sounds like me. It sounds like me talking. I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, it was you talking, and I tried to capture your voice. He's like, you did it perfectly. Well, that's
It's interesting
awesome.
you mentioned earlier, John, about Stephen King. And of course, Anthrax brought Stephen King straight into metal time again through
Yeah.
Scott Ian's lyrics.
Yeah. So I said, Scott, if you're ever interested in writing a book, I'd love to do it. He's like, you know what? I am. And the timing was just perfect. It was kismet.
Yeah.
And then my last book was with Agnostic Front's vocalist, Roger Moret. More of an underground book, came out on a smaller book company, but it's been really widely embraced. And I've always tried to do memoirs on people who've had stories to tell, experiences that have been both extreme and rejuvenating. So often there's this period of complete excess and debauchery and bad behavior. But in the end, a lot of these guys turn their lives around, have kids, have a wife, give to charity, whatever happens. I like to see that redemptive quality in some of these people, but some metal guys are just plagued. I mean, I love Korn and I love Jonathan Davis, and I'll let the cat out of the bag. That's going to be my next book.
Oh, is it? Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. Wow,
Yeah.
there's an interesting life. Wow.
But that was one that was in limbo for a little while because unfortunately his wife of many years and the mother of his two children died not so long ago, sending him to a tailspin. Word is now that he wants to continue with the book, which I'm delighted about, and that's going to be an incredible story. Just even if I wrote the shittiest book, the content is so good. This guy worked in a morgue. Talk about death. In high school, he had an internship with the coroner's office in California, in Bakersfield, California. So he was pulling bodies out of car wrecks, and he was doing operational procedures on dead bodies, kind of sucking out fluids from the eye orifice and other kind of grisly things that happen before you're preparing a body for post-mortem, or when you're doing that. And then he got a job as a mortician or assistant mortician after he finished his internship, went to mortuary school. This experience with death, he wanted to just experience the ultimate. Like, he's always been way into extremism. And even as a teenager, he'd seen Faces of Death, the movie, and lots of horror movies. So we had this opportunity to work in the coroner's office. He embraced it, figuring this will get me, this will be the real thing. And it was. And some of the things that he witnessed traumatized him for life. And later years, he went into PTSD because of all the horrific things that he had to deal with. So that's just a great facet of his story, because you hear of extreme metal guys and these crazy lives, but to work in a coroner's office and cut up dead bodies and is just such a grisly kind of outrageous experience. The band had its share of course, ups and downs and extreme periods of drug abuse and excess and sex and groupies and whatnot, before members left and other guys came in and things sort of evened themselves out. But he remains a very, very dark individual, and has referred to himself as sort of a pain magnet. Like, for all these horrific experiences he goes through, he thinks his fans get something positive out of it, which is, I think, a really constructive and positive way to look at some of the real horrors of life that unfortunately he's been dealt.
Maybe
so
Philip,
much.
Yeah, Philippe, maybe you have your books as well. You can show it your books as well. You have one about quantum physics. And
I feel bad. Well, only if John holds up one of his. I feel plugging it. So let's.
Around here.
That's mine.
Goes to 11, so you even get a metal reference into your book.
Absolutely.
I do have a louder than hell.
There are, the whole premise of this is that there are deep and really fundamental and
cool.
legitimate links, strongly legitimate links between metal and quantum physics. In a nutshell, metal is a form of music, although some would argue otherwise, but it is. Therefore, it's sound waves. Quantum physics is fundamentally physics of waves, theory of waves. There's where the links are. And quite a lot of references to quite a few of the bands John mentioned. So, yeah.
So this is the first we've managed to link quantum physics, death, and metal.
That's
good day. Good job. We can all go home happy.
okay.
If I could do a quick slideshow.
No, don't worry. We will edit it anyway. So, guys, you can show your books louder than
Okay,
hell.
that's louder than hell.
Okay.
Is that, okay. And then this was the Al
I just
Jourgensen
got
book
the one.
on ministry, which was a complete blast.
Yeah.
Very good.
And this is actually one of the more fascinating reads, because this guy lived it all. He came from Cuba and had a horribly abusive upbringing, was paramount in creating the crossover metal scene in the Lower East Side with bands like Cro-Mags and Sheer Terror and others. And he lived on the streets, basically. They squatted and didn't have homes. And then now he's at a point where he's in Phoenix, and he has a family, and he's an electrician. Oh, he also went to jail for drug not violations, but he was currying drugs and was caught as a mule and got an 18-month to life sentence. He was fortunately let out, but since he was from Cuba, there was a point where he might have faced being deported. So he has amazing things to say, and it's for anybody who likes hardcore punk or crossover metal. It's a really fun read.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Again, please support the show by signing up at deathhangout.com or clicking on the subscribe button on your screen.